Right now, somewhere beneath your feet, there is a city no one remembers, not a ruin, not a faded monument, a city. With streets, drainage systems, public squares, and homes where families ate meals, argued about politics, watched the sun rise. A city with a name that no living tongue can pronounce, because the language it belonged to has been dead for so long that even the memory of its sound has vanished. A city that one day simply ceased to exist, not just physically but conceptually, erased from every map, every story, every oral tradition, as though someone had reached into the collective memory of humanity and plucked it out like a loose thread. And it is not the only one. We tell ourselves a particular story about the past. You probably learned some version of it in school. It goes something like this. Humanity began as scattered nomadic tribes, then slowly organized into villages, then towns, then kingdoms. Writing was invented, laws were codified. Empires rose and empires fell and new ones took their place. Each generation built upon the last. Progress moved forward, always forward, like a river flowing inevitably toward the sea. It's a comforting story, and large parts of it are true, but it has a problem. The story has holes in it. Not small holes, not footnotes waiting to be filled in. Enormous, yawning chasms, centuries-wide stretches of total silence, where entire civilizations vanished, where writing systems evaporated overnight, where millions of human beings simply disappeared from the historical record as though someone had taken a blade to the manuscript of human history and sliced out whole chapters at a time. Tonight, I'm going to take you through some of these silences, not to give you easy answers because there are none, not to spin conspiracy theories or invoke lost Atlantises, but to let you feel the weight of what we've lost, to stand at the edge of each gap and look down into the darkness and understand that what stares back at us is not emptiness. It is absence. The absence of voices that once spoke, of knowledge that once existed, of people who once lived full and complicated lives, who loved and grieved and built and dreamed, and whose stories have been stolen from us by time, by catastrophe, by conquest, and by the brutal indifference of a universe that does not care whether we remember. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. You don't need to hold on tightly. You don't need to remember anything. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that's perfectly fine. The story will carry you and you can come back to it another night. The past is patient. It has been waiting for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. Before the collapse, there was a world, and in that world there was an island. Crete, in the eastern Mediterranean, a long spine of mountains rising out of the sea between Greece and Egypt. And on Crete, beginning sometime around 2000 BCE, there arose what may have been the first true maritime civilization of Europe, the Minoans. We call them Minoans because a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans called them that, in 1900, when he began excavating the ruins of a vast palace complex at Knossos, and decided on the strength of Greek mythology that it must have belonged to the legendary king Minos. Evans dug for decades. He uncovered a labyrinth of corridors, multi-story apartments with working drainage, storerooms filled with enormous ceramic jars called pithoi, frescoes painted in vivid blues and ochres, depicting dolphins and bulls and young athletes leaping over the horns of charging animals. He found similar palaces at Phaistos, Malea and Zakros. He found country villas and mountain sanctuaries and harbour towns humming with trade, and he found clay tablets, hundreds and hundreds of them, inscribed with a script nobody had ever seen. Evans actually discovered 3 distinct writing systems on Crete, a pictographic script he called Cretan hieroglyphic, and 2 more abstract scripts he called simply Linear A and Linear B. He did not know, at the time, which was older. He did not know what language they recorded. He did not live to see either one deciphered. In 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris, working with the American scholar Alice Kober, whose index cards he inherited after her early death, cracked Linear B. Kober had done the painstaking work of sorting the signs by statistical behaviour, identifying patterns of grammatical inflection, pointing the way. Ventris took her method to its conclusion and announced, to the astonishment of the classical world, that Linear B was Greek, an early form of Greek, the Greek of the Mycenaean kings, written centuries before Homer. The tablets were administrative records, inventories of livestock, lists of offerings to gods, receipts for textiles and grain. written by Greek-speaking scribes in a system they had borrowed from the Minoans and adapted to their own tongue around 1450 BCE. But Linear A, the older script, the Minoan script, the one the Mycenaeans had borrowed from, Linear A remains unread. And this is where the strangeness deepens, because we can sound it out. Many of the signs in Linear A look identical to signs in Linear B, and when the Mycenaeans adapted the script, they presumably kept the phonetic values of the signs they reused. So if you read a Linear A tablet aloud using the sound values known from Linear B, you can pronounce the words, you can say them. What you cannot do is understand them, because the language underneath is not Greek. It is not Egyptian or Hittite or Akkadian or Semitic or any other tongue anyone has ever been able to match it to. It is the Minoan language, and whatever it was, it left no identifiable descendants, and no bilingual Rosetta Stone has ever been found to anchor it to a known tongue. The corpus is not tiny. Approximately 1,427 Linear A inscriptions survive, containing somewhere between 7,362 and 7,396 individual signs in total. The largest caches come from Hagia Triada on Crete, where 147 tablets were recovered, from Cahokia with 99 clay tablet fragments, from Zakros with 31, from Phaistos with 26. A handful of tablet fragments have been found far from Crete, on Santorini, on Kea, on Samothrace, at Miletus on the Turkish coast, even at Tel Haror and Tel Lachish in modern Israel. Evidence that Minoan trade networks reached across the eastern Mediterranean. The script used roughly 90 distinct signs, a mixture of syllabic phonograms, ideograms, and symbols for quantities and commodities. The tablets appear to be administrative records, primarily inventories, receipts, lists. But imagine what these texts would contain if we could read them. The names of Minoan kings, the names of their gods, the words they used for the sea, for the bull, for love, for rain, the rituals performed at their peak sanctuaries, the negotiations that kept peace among the palaces of the island for 7 centuries. All of it lies on those tablets, sounded out and silent, waiting. Something happened to Minoan civilization in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, and no one is entirely sure what. The island of Thera, 70 miles north of Crete, the island we now call Santorini, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events of the Holocene epoch. The precise date remains debated among specialists. Radiocarbon analysis of a buried olive branch at Akrotiri, the Minoan town preserved by volcanic ash on Thera itself, pointed researchers to a date between 1627 and 1600 BCE. More recent tree ring analysis of Mediterranean juniper, published in 2020 by Charlotte Pearson and colleagues, suggests a date closer to 1560 BCE. The difference may seem small, but it matters enormously for correlating the eruption with Egyptian chronology and with the Minoan archaeological record. What is not disputed is the scale. The Thera eruption released an estimated 60 cubic kilometres of magma, collapsed much of the island into the sea, generated tsunamis that struck the northern coast of Crete, and darkened skies across the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan settlement of Akrotiri, a town of multi-storey buildings, painted frescoes, paved streets, and sophisticated drainage, was buried under metres of volcanic ash, preserved like a Bronze Age Pompeii. Its inhabitants seem to have evacuated before the final eruption, because no bodies have been found in the ruins. For a long time, scholars assumed that Thera destroyed the Minoan civilization directly. Recent research has complicated that story. The Minoans seem to have survived the eruption, rebuilt, and continued flourishing for perhaps 150 years afterward. But something was weakened. Around 1450 BCE, roughly a century and a half after the eruption, the palaces of Crete were destroyed one after another by fire. Mycenaean Greeks took control of Knossos, began keeping their records in Linear B, and absorbed what remained of Minoan trading networks into their own palatial economy. The Minoan language stopped being written. The Minoan gods acquired Greek names. The island's own voice fell silent, and all that was left was the tablet hoard at Hagia Triada, and the ones scattered across the smaller palaces, mute records that scholars 100 generations later would pick over without ever cracking. The Minoans are the prelude. They are the first great silence of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. a civilization that sophisticated the art of fresco, built plumbing that rivaled Rome, sailed to half a dozen foreign shores, and left behind a writing system we can almost read. Their fall was not the collapse. Their fall was the warning that came before the collapse, and it went unheeded by everyone who came after. Because 250 years later, the broader world they had once traded with would burn in its turn. Let me paint you a picture. It's roughly 1250 BCE, and the Eastern Mediterranean is experiencing what you might call a golden age, though even that phrase doesn't quite do it justice. This isn't just prosperity. This is the most interconnected, most culturally vibrant, most technologically sophisticated civilization the world has ever seen. Nothing like it has existed before. Nothing like it will exist again for nearly 1,000 years. Consider the players. In Egypt, the new kingdom is at its zenith. Rameses the Great, Rameses II, has just fought the Hittites to a stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history, involving an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots from both sides combined. Rather than continue the war, the two empires did something unprecedented. They signed a peace treaty, not a temporary truce, a formal diplomatic agreement, copies of which survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. It is the oldest known international treaty in the world, and it included provisions for the extradition of political refugees, a level of diplomatic sophistication that should make us reconsider any assumption we might have about the primitive, ancient world. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire controls a vast territory stretching from the Aegean coast to modern-day Syria, its capital Hattusa a sprawling city surrounded by massive limestone fortification walls, punctuated by elaborately decorated gates. The Hittites were among the earliest civilizations to develop iron smelting techniques. Their legal code was sophisticated, their diplomatic correspondence voluminous, their religious literature extensive. Across the sea, Mycenaean Greece has built palace complexes of staggering ambition, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, their rulers corresponding with foreign kings in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, the English of the ancient world. Mycenaean traders carried their distinctive pottery to every corner of the Mediterranean. Along the Levantine coast, port cities like Ugarit hum with international trade. Ugarit alone has yielded texts in 7 different languages. Ships carry tin from Afghanistan, gold from Egypt and Nubia, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic shores thousands of miles to the north, olive oil and wine from Greece, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Central Asia, ivory from East Africa. This was not a primitive world. This was a globalized one. Bronze was the crude oil of its age, and like crude oil, it required materials sourced from opposite ends of the known world. And then, in what amounts to the blink of an eye, all of it was destroyed. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, a span of just 50 years, barely 2 human generations, this entire world collapsed. Not declined, not gradually faded, collapsed. The Hittite Empire didn't wither away over centuries the way Rome eventually would. It was annihilated, burned to nothing so quickly that the destruction feels almost instantaneous in the archaeological record. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, archaeologists digging through the ruins found a thin black layer directly above the floor level of its buildings, a layer composed of ash, charred wood, and rubble scorched in an intensely destructive fire, dating to around 1200 BCE. After that destruction layer, the archaeological record falls silent. The city sat empty for centuries afterward, a haunted and abandoned place. 20 kilometres north, at Alaka Hoyuk, where the Hittites had buried their kings in opulent tombs for generations, the same evidence of fiery destruction appears in the same stratum. Ugarit, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan port cities in the ancient world, was so thoroughly destroyed that it was never resettled. The last letter ever sent from its king was found in a kiln, unbaked, never delivered, a desperate plea for military assistance against approaching enemies. The king wrote that enemy ships had already been sighted. Help never came. The city burned, and the letter remained in the kiln for more than 3,000 years, a frozen cry from the last moments of a dying world. Mycenae burned. Pylos burned. The palace at Pylos, which has provided us with some of the richest Linear B archives in existence, shows evidence of desperate last-minute defensive preparations, walls hastily reinforced, supplies stockpiled. Before the final conflagration consumed everything, Troy burned. Across the Peloponnese, up to 90% of small settlements were abandoned, suggesting a catastrophic depopulation that went far beyond the destruction of individual cities. In the generations that followed, some scholars estimate that Greece may have lost as much as 80% of its total population. That number is almost incomprehensible, and it wasn't just cities and populations that perished, it was knowledge itself. The Mycenaean Greeks had developed Linear B, a syllabic writing system used primarily for palace administrative records. After the palace system collapsed, there was no one left who needed to keep such records, and no institution to maintain the scribble tradition. Linear B vanished. Greece would not produce another written document for nearly 400 years. When Greeks finally began writing again, they used an entirely different script, one borrowed from the Phoenicians and adapted to the Greek language. They had no memory of Linear B, they didn't even know it had existed. So what happened? What could possibly have destroyed the most advanced civilization on Earth in the span of a single human lifetime? There are theories, several of them, and each explains part of the picture while leaving the rest shrouded in shadow. The first involves the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records from the reign of Rameses III, around 1178 BCE, describe massive naval and land battles against a confederation of mysterious raiders who attacked the Nile Delta in force. Temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu, Ramesses' mortuary temple, depict these invaders in vivid detail. Warriors in distinctive helmets, some horned, some feathered, arriving in fleets of warships unlike anything the Egyptians were accustomed to fighting. Accompanying the warriors were ox carts carrying women and children, as though entire nations were on the move, migrating rather than merely raiding. We don't know whether they caused the collapse, or were themselves refugees fleeing it. Were they the fire, or were they running from the fire? The second theory points to climate change, and recent scientific evidence has given it considerable force. A study published in the journal Nature in 2023, led by Sturt Manning of Cornell University, analysed tree rings from juniper trees preserved at the archaeological site of Gordion in central Anatolia. By measuring both ring widths and stable isotope ratios, the researchers pinpointed a severe 3-year continuous drought between 1198 and 1196 BCE, plus or minus 3 years, right in the heartland of the Hittite Empire, right at the moment of its collapse. In the 12-year period from 1198 to 1187, 6 to 8 of those years fell in the lowest 20% of moisture values in the entire 400-year record. This was not a bad season. This was generational catastrophe. Paleoclimatic evidence from the Sorek Cave Formation in Israel confirms an unprecedented and sustained decline in rainfall persisting through 1150 BCE and beyond. The Hittite Empire, whose agricultural heartland depended on reliable rainfall rather than river irrigation, was particularly vulnerable. The empire probably could have survived a single bad year. 3 consecutive years of drought exceeded what anyone would have prepared for. There are even records of Egypt sending grain shipments to the Hittites, traditional enemies, suggesting that the famine was severe enough to override centuries of geopolitical rivalry. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. Droughts don't typically reduce stone cities to ash. The sheer totality of the destruction suggests something more violent and more sudden than agricultural decline alone. The third theory is perhaps the most unsettling. It's called the systems collapse model, and it argues that the very interconnectedness that made the Bronze Age so prosperous also made it catastrophically fragile. The late Bronze Age economy operated like an extraordinarily complex machine with no redundancy. Tin, essential for making bronze, had to travel thousands of miles to reach Mediterranean workshops. Copper came from Cyprus. Grain moved between empires to balance regional shortfalls. Diplomatic alliances maintained the political stability that allowed trade to flow freely. When one element of this system failed, whether from drought, invasion, earthquake, or revolt, the shock didn't stay contained. It propagated through the entire network. One kingdom's collapse disrupted the trade routes that other kingdoms depended on. That disruption caused economic stress in the dependent kingdoms, which created political instability, which caused further collapse, in a cascading spiral that no single actor could arrest. The truth is almost certainly some combination of all three, and recent scholarship has complicated the narrative in important ways. The archaeologist Jesse Millick has demonstrated that of the 148 archaeological sites traditionally attributed to the Bronze Age collapse, 61% were either misdated, assumed based on thin evidence, or simply never destroyed at all. Cities like Hama, Aleppo, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon and Jerusalem appear on maps of destruction but show no archaeological evidence of destruction during this period. The collapse was real, but it was messier, more uneven, more geographically variable than the neat narrative of universal catastrophe suggests. What is not in dispute is the staggering scope of what was lost. Greece entered a period of such profound regression that historians call it the Greek Dark Ages. For 400 years, the Aegean world had no writing, no monumental architecture, no significant international trade. When Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, sometime in the 8th century BCE, he was telling stories about a vanished world whose actual history no living person remembered. His descriptions of Bronze Age palaces, Bronze Age warfare and Bronze Age society are a mix of genuine memory, distorted tradition, and pure invention, and we cannot reliably distinguish one from the other. Here is the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is not a comfortable one. Sophistication is not the same as durability. The very qualities that make a civilization impressive, its complexity, its interconnection, its specialization, are the same qualities that make it fragile. The Bronze Age world had optimized for prosperity, not for resilience. And when the stresses came, the system shattered rather than bent. When the lights came back on, the Bronze Age was gone forever. The fall of Rome is probably the most famous collapse in Western history. It occupies a special place in the imagination. The crumbling Colosseum, the barbarian hordes pouring through the gates, the last emperor falling on his sword in a final blaze of defiant glory. It's a dramatic image. It's also almost entirely wrong. Here is what actually happened. In 476 CE, a teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus, a boy who bore, by cruel irony, the name of Rome's legendary founder, was quietly deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. Romulus was not killed. He was not imprisoned. He was retired to a comfortable villa in Campania with a pension. Odoacer didn't even bother to claim the title of emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor, with a polite note suggesting that one emperor was enough. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang, not with a dramatic siege, not with a screaming mob storming the Senate, but with a bureaucratic formality so understated that most people living through it probably didn't realize it had happened. And that is what makes the fall of Rome so much more frightening than its mythologized version. Because the physical infrastructure of Roman civilization was still standing. The roads were intact. The aqueducts were functional. The bridges still spanned their rivers. The libraries still held their books. The technology, the knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of engineering and administration, all of it was still there, embedded in stone and brick and parchment, waiting to be used. But the people who understood how to use it were disappearing. Here is the thing about Roman literacy. Reading and writing in the Roman world were not valued as abstract virtues. They were job skills, practical vocational job skills. You learned to read because your work in urban administration, commercial accounting, legal practice, or military engineering required it. Literacy was a tool, and like any tool, it was maintained only so long as there was work for it to do. When the cities shrank, and they shrank dramatically, losing 80 to 90% of their populations across much of the Western Empire, the jobs that required literacy vanished. There were no more tax rolls to maintain, no more commercial contracts to draft, no more engineering specifications to write. In the countryside, where the overwhelming majority of the population now lived, Latin literacy was useless. You could not eat a codex. You could not plough a field with a legal precedent. Within 2 generations, perhaps 40 to 60 years, the ability to read and write Latin disappeared across large parts of the former Western Empire. Not because it was forbidden, not because some barbarian king ordered the books burned. It was simply forgotten, because nobody needed it anymore, and therefore nobody taught it to their children. This is knowledge death by neglect, the most common and the most insidious form, and it can happen with terrifying speed. And when literacy died, Technical knowledge went with it, because Roman technical knowledge was primarily transmitted through written manuals. The Romans had written extensive, detailed guides on engineering, architecture, hydraulics, surveying, road construction, concrete making, bridge building, aqueduct maintenance, 100 other practical subjects. Those manuals still existed physically, sitting on shelves in abandoned villas and crumbling public buildings, but they were now as incomprehensible to the people living among the ruins as an advanced physics textbook would be to someone who had never learned to read. Imagine finding a detailed step-by-step instruction manual for maintaining a nuclear power plant, written in a language you cannot understand, surrounded by machinery whose purpose you can only guess at. That is what Roman technical literature was to a 6th century British farmer standing in the ruins of a bathhouse, whose underfloor heating system he assumed was the work of giants or gods. The archaeological record tells this story with heartbreaking clarity. In Britain, the collapse was nearly total. By 500 CE, fewer than a century after the last Roman legions withdrew in 410, the cities had been abandoned. London, which had been a thriving administrative and commercial centre of perhaps 30,000 people under Roman rule, was largely deserted. Excavations have shown that the great stone buildings of Roman Londinium were in ruins, their roofs collapsed, their walls crumbling. Pottery production reverted from sophisticated wheel-thrown ceramics, fired in industrial kilns, to crude handmade vessels barely distinguishable from those produced 2,000 years earlier. Stone construction stopped entirely. Archaeologists have given a name to what they find in the archaeological strata of British cities from this period: dark earth. When you excavate through the layers of a city like London or York or Cirencester, you pass through clear Roman occupation layers, stone foundations, tiled floors, coins, pottery sherds, and then you hit a thick layer of dark, organically rich soil. This dark earth is the accumulated residue of centuries of abandonment, decomposing refuse, collapsed wooden structures, wind-blown soil, animal waste, vegetable matter. It is the physical signature of what happens when a city dies, and the land slowly, patiently reclaims it. It is the archaeological equivalent of silence. In some places, the dark earth is several feet thick. It represents centuries of time during which these former Roman cities were either completely deserted or home to scattered, impoverished squatters living in wooden shacks built among stone buildings they could neither repair nor comprehend. The situation was less severe in other parts of the former empire. Italy maintained somewhat more continuity, partly because the Ostrogothic rulers who took power made genuine efforts to preserve Roman institutions. Gaul retained some administrative structures under Frankish rule. The Eastern Roman Empire, of course, survived and thrived for another 1,000 years as what we call Byzantium, preserving Greek learning and Roman administrative tradition in an unbroken chain. But even in regions where the collapse was partial, the losses were staggering. Consider the monasteries, which represent both the salvation and the tragedy of post-Roman learning. For centuries, the monasteries were the thin, fragile thread connecting the post-Roman world to its classical inheritance. We owe the monks an incalculable debt, but the monks copied selectively. They prioritized what mattered to them: scripture, theology, hagiography, the writings of the Church Fathers. Secular literature, Roman poetry, philosophy, natural history, science, engineering, history, legal theory, survived only when it happened to interest a particular monk. And when parchment was scarce, as it frequently was, given that producing a single vellum manuscript required the skins of an entire flock of sheep, monks scraped the ink off existing manuscripts and wrote new texts on the recycled material. These recycled manuscripts are called palimpsests. Every palimpsest is a palimpsest of loss. When modern scholars applied multispectral imaging technology to certain palimpsests, technology that can detect traces of the original ink beneath the later overwriting, they found astonishing things. Lost works of Archimedes, unknown plays by Sophocles, Roman engineering treatises previously unknown to scholarship. Each recovery was a small miracle, but each recovery also underscored the vastness of what was lost, because for every text accidentally preserved beneath a later manuscript, there are presumably thousands that were scraped clean and overwritten without any trace remaining. Civilization, it turns out, is not a permanent condition. It is a practice, a habit, a set of skills and institutions that must be actively maintained by each generation. The moment the chain of transmission breaks, it dies. And it can die with terrifying speed. If you had stood on the banks of the Mississippi River around 1100 CE and looked eastward across the floodplain, you would have witnessed something that would shatter every assumption you've ever been taught about the Americas before Columbus. You would have seen a city, not a village, not a cluster of lodges, not a seasonal encampment, a city with a massive earthen pyramid rising 100 feet into the sky, its base covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Around it, more than 100 smaller mounds, a grand central plaza, 40 acres of open ceremonial space, larger than 35 football fields, a 2-mile-long wooden palisade studded with guard towers placed every 70 feet, neighbourhoods laid out in organised rows, with houses built from wooden posts and woven thatch, agricultural fields stretching toward the horizon, growing the corn, squash, and other crops that fed a population of somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 people. This was Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, and almost nobody has heard of it. The city's original name is lost. We call it Cahokia after an unrelated Illiniwek people who lived in the area centuries later, long after the original city had been abandoned and its builders had vanished. The Cahokia people of the 17th century were not descended from the city's original builders. They just happened to live nearby. The builders of Cahokia left no written records. Everything we know about their city comes from archaeology alone, from what they built, what they made, what they threw away, what they buried with their dead. And what archaeology has revealed is both awe-inspiring and profoundly incomplete. Monk's Mound, the central pyramid that towered over the city, was built entirely of packed earth. Millions of individual basket loads carried by hand to the construction site over decades of sustained effort. It contains roughly 22 million cubic feet of earth. It is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere. At its summit once stood a massive wooden building whose post holes suggest it measured over 100 feet long. To the west of Monk's Mound, a series of circular wooden post alignments, dubbed Woodhenge by archaeologists, functioned as astronomical observatories and calendars. The evenly spaced red cedar posts were arranged to track the rising points of the sun at the equinoxes and solstices. At least 5 different versions of Woodhenge were built over the centuries. The city's trade networks were extraordinary. Archaeologists have found copper artifacts made from raw materials sourced in the Great Lakes region, shell beads from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, shark teeth from the Atlantic coast. Chemical analysis of pottery residues even found evidence that Cahokians consumed a caffeinated holly tea, a stimulant drink used ritually by native peoples across the southeast. This was the hub of a continental network. Strontium isotope analysis of the teeth of dozens of individuals buried at Cahokia reveals that at least 20% were immigrants who had come from elsewhere. This city attracted people from across the Mississippian world, and then, by 1350 CE, it was empty. The mound stood silent, the palisade had rotted away, there's no evidence of a final battle, no ash layer from a devastating fire, no mass grave from a massacre. The city simply emptied out over perhaps a century and a half, its population dispersing into the surrounding landscape, their urban identity dissolving like sugar in water. By the 1500s, when European explorers first entered the Mississippi Valley, the local indigenous peoples had no memory of who had built the mounds or why they were there. Was it environmental degradation? The city's population had put tremendous pressure on local resources. The palisade alone required 20,000 logs for each of its 4 known reconstructions, 80,000 large trees just for the wall. Was it political upheaval? Was it climate change? Tree ring data shows a period of increasing dryness and episodic flooding around 1200 CE. The honest answer is we don't know. We may never know. And Cahokia was not unique. In the desert southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff cities of breathtaking sophistication. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Pueblo Bonito contained over 600 rooms and stood 4 stories high. It was one of the largest buildings in North America for centuries. The Chaco system included hundreds of miles of perfectly straight roads, some up to 30 feet wide, connecting outlying communities to the central canyon complex. These roads were not paths worn by casual foot traffic. They were engineered structures, cut straight through mesas and arroyos with geometric precision that speaks of sophisticated surveying and centralized planning, and around 1150 CE they left. The great houses were emptied, the roads fell into disuse, the people migrated south and east, eventually becoming the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples. But why they left remains largely a mystery. Now multiply this pattern across an entire hemisphere, and then add the most catastrophic demographic event in human history. When Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, the Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people. These were not, as colonial propaganda would later insist, scattered tribes wandering through an empty wilderness. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities on Earth, with a population estimated at over 200,000. The Inca Empire controlled a territory stretching 4,000 kilometers along the Andes. The Maya had independently developed a fully functional writing system, a sophisticated calendar more accurate than the one used in contemporary Europe, and mathematical concepts including the number 0. Within a century of sustained European contact, scholars estimate that somewhere between half and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died, not primarily from warfare, though warfare played a role, from disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, plague, a cascade of old-world pathogens to which indigenous Americans had no immunological defense, crashed through the hemisphere like a biological wildfire. The diseases moved faster than the Europeans themselves. Epidemics travelled along trade routes and waterways, leaping from community to community, killing people who had never seen a European face. The Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, travelling through the southeastern United States between 1539 and 1542, described densely populated, prosperous, politically organised towns along the Mississippi River. When French explorers returned to the same region 150 years later, they found a nearly empty landscape. The towns de Soto had described were gone. The people who had inhabited them were dead, killed by the epidemics that de Soto's own expedition had, unknowingly, helped to spread. And with the people went their knowledge. In cultures where history was preserved orally, where the accumulated wisdom, the genealogies, the legal traditions, the religious narratives, the technical knowledge of a people was stored in the memories of trained specialists and transmitted from elder to student through years of careful instruction, the death of a single knowledgeable elder could represent the loss of an irreplaceable library. When an epidemic killed half or more of a community in a matter of weeks, the loss was not merely demographic, it was intellectual. The stories, the songs, the names, the explanations, the meanings, all of it could vanish in a single season of death. Recent discoveries have revealed just how much was lost. In the Amazon rainforest, long believed by Western scholars to be a pristine, untouched wilderness, LiDAR technology has revealed a hidden world. In Ecuador's Upano Valley, published in the journal Science in January 2024, researchers led by archaeologist Stephen Rostain of France's National Centre for Scientific Research described a network of interconnected cities more than 2,500 years old, spanning over 300 square kilometres. More than 6,000 rectangular earthen platforms, connected by wide, carefully engineered roads built at precise right angles, form what amounts to an organised urban landscape, comparable in scale to the garden cities of the classic Maya. The sites were occupied from around 500 BCE to between 300 and 600 CE. Then they were abandoned, for reasons that remain unclear. In the Bolivian Amazon, researchers have documented the Kasarabi culture, which built urban centres between roughly 500 and 1400 CE, with stepped platforms, conical earthen pyramids reaching 70 feet in height, concentric moats and defensive ramparts, and radiating causeways stretching for kilometres. This was large-scale environmental engineering, reshaping thousands of square miles of terrain to support a substantial population. And researchers now estimate that between 10 and 24,000 pre-Columbian earthworks may exist throughout the Amazon basin, the vast majority still unmapped, undocumented, and unknown. We have better records of ancient Rome than we do of Cahokia, which was thriving just 600 years ago. We know more about the pharaohs of Egypt than about the rulers of Chaco Canyon. We can read Sumerian commercial receipts from 4,000 years ago, but cannot read a single word left behind by the builders of the Mississippian civilization because they had no writing to leave. Now let me take you somewhere older, further south, further back. In October of 1994, a Peruvian archaeologist named Ruth Shady Solis began studying a series of dusty mounds scattered across the Soup Valley, about 200 kilometers north of Lima. An American historian, Paul Kosok, had briefly visited the area in 1948 and called the largest mound Chupacigaro Grande. He had noted it and then moved on. The site was too far from the ocean to match the profile of known coastal cultures, and it seemed to lack the pottery fragments that normally allowed archaeologists to date Peruvian settlements. For nearly half a century after Kosok, almost no one returned. Shady returned. And what she realised, slowly, carefully, against the scepticism of her colleagues, was that the absence of pottery was not a sign that the site was unimportant. It was a sign that the site was older than pottery, older than any organised settlement anyone had ever found in the Americas. The site is now called Caral, and radiocarbon dating of reed bags, called shikras, which the builders had filled with stones and packed into the retaining walls of their pyramids, returned dates around 2627 BCE, give or take a few decades. When Shady published these results in the journal Science in April 2001, the implications were almost too large to absorb. Caral was contemporary with the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt. It predated the Olmec civilization, long thought to be Mesoamerica's mother culture, by more than 1,500 years, and it had risen in total isolation, with no contact with any other literate civilization on Earth. The urban complex at Caral spreads across more than 150 acres. 6 large pyramidal structures rise above a carefully organised plaza. The Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, measures nearly 500 feet in length, 360 feet in width, and 92 feet in height. Sunken circular plazas, some of them large enough to hold hundreds of people, are set into the ground in front of the pyramids. Residential buildings cluster in neighbourhoods that appear to be organised by social function. And Caral was only one of nearly 30 related settlements in the Norte Chico region, a network of early cities along the Soup, Pativilca, and Fortaleza rivers that collectively represent the oldest known civilization in the Americas, and one of only 6 places on Earth where civilization is believed to have originated independently, without outside influence. Here is what makes Caral strange. There are no weapons, no fortifications, no battlements, no evidence of massacres, no mutilated bodies. Across the dozens of sites excavated so far, no signs of warfare have been found. This is extraordinary. Most theories about the origins of civilization assume that complex societies arise in response to the pressures of conflict, that people surrender their individual autonomy to a chief, a king, a priest, because they need protection from enemies. But Caral arose without visible enemies. It organised itself around something other than defence. Ruth Shady has proposed, based on decades of work at the site, that Caral was organised around trade, specifically around the exchange of cotton, which Caral's inland farmers produced and which coastal communities needed to weave the nets they used for fishing. A society built around cooperation, not conquest. Inside one of the temples, Shady's team found 32 flutes made from the bones of condors and pelicans, and 37 cornets made from the bones of deer and llamas. Music, it seems, was central to ritual life. Whoever these people were, they sang, they played, they gathered by the hundreds in their circular plazas, and they made sound together. There is one artifact from Caral that continues to unsettle scholars. Among the finds is a knotted textile piece that appears to be a quipu, the knotted string recording device that the Inca would use 3,000 years later to manage one of the largest empires in pre-modern history. If Shady's interpretation is correct, the Caral quipu is the oldest known example of this technology, evidence that the Andean tradition of record-keeping through knotted strings may stretch back to the very beginning of civilization in the region. We cannot read it. We do not know what information the knots encoded, but something was being recorded, something was being remembered, by a people who left behind no writing at all. Around 1800 BCE, after flourishing for more than 1,000 years, Caral was abandoned. In 2025, new work by Shady's team has linked the decline to a prolonged drought around 2200 BCE, part of what climate scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a global arid episode that disrupted civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Excavations at later Norte Chico sites like Vishama on the Pacific coast have uncovered temple friezes depicting scenes of famine and death, stylized images of starving figures, pregnant women, large fish, and a lightning-struck toad, which researchers interpret as a visual record of the drought and the hoped-for return of rainfall. And in 2024, Shady's team opened Panico to researchers and visitors for the first time, a 3,500-year-old inland settlement that appears to represent a direct continuation of Caral's architectural and ceremonial traditions in the centuries after the original city was abandoned. The Caral people did not collapse into warfare. They relocated. They rebuilt, carrying their architectural knowledge and ceremonial practices with them, adapting their cities to whatever new watersheds and trade networks would sustain them, and even then their influence persisted. For the next 4,000 years, every major civilization in the Central Andes, the Chavin, the Moche, the Wari, the Inca, would build stepped pyramids, sunken circular plazas, and platform complexes whose basic forms were laid down at Caral. They did not write their language. We do not know what they called themselves, but we stand inside their architectural imagination whenever we walk through the ruins of Machu Picchu. There is a civilization that haunts the history of the ancient world. It left behind magnificent cities, exquisite craftsmanship, evidence of a society of remarkable sophistication and organization, and then it sealed itself behind a wall of undecipherable symbols and fell utterly silent. That silence has lasted 4,000 years. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, after one of its major sites, emerged around 3,300 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. At its peak, between approximately 2,600 and 1900 BCE, it was one of the three great urban civilizations of the ancient world, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. But in several important respects, it was the most impressive of the three. At its height, the Indus Valley Civilization encompassed an estimated 5 million people. It spread across an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, covering much of modern Pakistan, northwestern India, parts of Afghanistan, and stretching to the coast of the Arabian Sea. More than 1,400 settlements have been identified. The two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro in the south and Harappa in the north, had populations of 40,000 or more, and the cities themselves are extraordinary. When archaeologists first excavated Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, they found something that defied every expectation. The city was laid out on a precise grid, with main streets running north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles. This wasn't the organic, haphazard growth pattern typical of ancient cities. This was deliberate, centralized urban planning, implemented across the entire city from the very beginning. And the bricks were standardized. Across hundreds of settlements separated by hundreds of miles, the Indus people used bricks manufactured to the same dimensional ratio, a proportion of roughly 4 to 2 to 1, length to width to thickness. This standardization implies centralized authority, manufacturing oversight, and a system of weights and measures that could ensure uniformity across an enormous geographical area. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro was connected to a covered drainage system, an underground network of brick-lined channels that carried wastewater away from homes and into larger main drains running beneath the streets. These drains were equipped with inspection holes at regular intervals, allowing maintenance workers to access and clean them. The Indus system's thoroughness, its extension to virtually every private dwelling, represents a standard of universal domestic sanitation that many European cities would not achieve until the 19th century. And here we arrive at the most remarkable and most frustrating feature of the Indus civilization, what it lacks. There are no obvious palaces, no monumental temples on the scale of Egyptian or Mesopotamian religious architecture, no colossal statues of kings or gods, no victory monuments, no elaborate royal tombs filled with treasures, no clear evidence of an elite quarter dramatically separated from the rest of the population. Whatever form of government the Indus people practiced, it left almost no trace of individual power or individual glorification. This is almost unique in the ancient world. Every other civilization we know of that achieved this level of complexity did so under the direction of visibly powerful rulers who announced their authority through monumental architecture and self-aggrandizing art. The Indus civilization achieved comparable complexity and maintained it for 700 years without leaving any such evidence. Either their rulers were remarkably modest, or their society operated on principles of authority fundamentally different from anything else we've encountered. We don't know which, and they will not tell us because of the script. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been recovered from Indus Valley sites: stamp seals, pottery fragments, clay tablets, metal tools. They carry approximately 400 distinct signs, a number that has led most scholars to conclude that the script is logographic, that each sign represents a word or concept rather than a sound. But this conclusion is uncertain. Strong arguments have been made for other interpretations, including the possibility that the signs are not a writing system at all, but rather a system of non-linguistic symbols, identification marks, religious icons, clan emblems. The inscriptions are heartbreakingly brief. Most contain fewer than 5 signs. The longest known inscription is a mere 26 characters. This extreme brevity makes analysis extraordinarily difficult because the statistical tools that linguists use to identify patterns in unknown scripts require much larger samples of text. It's as though we found an ancient library where every book contained only its title, and the titles were written in a language no living person speaks. There is no Rosetta Stone for the Indus script, no bilingual inscription that might crack the code. The reading direction is not definitively established. The underlying language is unknown. For more than a century, scholars have attempted decipherment. Dozens of claims have been published. None has gained widespread acceptance. An Indian state government recently offered a reward of $1 million to anyone who could successfully decode the script, a measure of how desperately the knowledge is wanted and how firmly it remains locked away. Without being able to read the script, we cannot know what the Indus people called their civilization, their cities, their rivers, their gods. We cannot know the names of their rulers. We cannot access their laws, their stories, their understanding of the world. Everything we know about this civilization is external, derived from the shapes of their buildings, the residues in their cooking pots, the positions of their dead. It is as though we were trying to understand a person entirely from the outside, observing their actions but never hearing their voice. The end of the Indus Valley civilization is as mysterious as its inner life. Beginning around 1900 BCE, the cities began to decline. The population of Mohenjo-daro thinned. Construction quality deteriorated. Over the following centuries, the great cities were gradually abandoned. By 1300 BCE, they were largely deserted. But there is no evidence of violence, no burned layers, no mass graves, no fortification walls built in haste. The cities simply emptied out, slowly and, as far as we can tell, peacefully. The current best theory involves climate change, a shift in monsoon patterns that altered the flow of the rivers on which the civilization depended. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system appears to have changed course, or dried up during this period. The Vedic culture that emerged in northern India around 1500 BCE spoke an entirely unrelated language, Sanskrit belonging to the Indo-European family. And the Vedic texts contain no memory of the Indus cities, no reference to Mohenjo-daro, no mention of Harappa. The people who lived in the Indus Valley after the urban civilization collapsed had no awareness that those cities had ever existed. Africa's historical silences are different because they are not purely the result of time and natural catastrophe. They are also the product of deliberate human action, of choices made by specific people for specific reasons, choices that resulted in the systematic destruction of knowledge on a continental scale. The story of lost African history is inseparable from the story of colonialism. In the highlands of southeastern Africa, in the country that took its name from the ruins it contains, there stands a complex of stone structures covering 1,800 acres. The great enclosure at Great Zimbabwe features walls 36 feet high, constructed of carefully shaped granite blocks, fitted together without mortar in a technique that requires sophisticated understanding of load-bearing construction, stone shaping, and structural engineering. The walls taper inward as they rise, distributing weight with an elegance that speaks of long experience. At its peak, around 1300 CE, Great Zimbabwe housed roughly 18,000 people and served as the capital of a powerful kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the mineral-rich interior of southern Africa and the Swahili coast trading cities. Chinese porcelain and glass beads from the Indian Ocean trade network have been found among its ruins, testimony to its connections with a commercial system that stretched from the African interior to the markets of Arabia, India, and beyond. When European colonists encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they were confronted with a problem. The ruins were too impressive to ignore, but too clearly African to fit the colonial narrative. And so the colonizers lied. They attributed the ruins to Phoenician traders, to the builders of King Solomon's temple, to lost Arab settlers, to anyone and everyone except the African people who had actually lived there. This denial was a sustained, deliberate campaign of historical erasure, maintained for decades by colonial governments, supported by compliant scholars, and backed by the full weight of imperial authority. The Kingdom of Kush thrived along the Nile in what is now Sudan from roughly 1070 BCE to 350 CE, a span of nearly 1400 years, longer than the entire history of the Roman Republic and Empire combined. At its height, Kush conquered and ruled Egypt itself, establishing the 25th dynasty. Kushite rulers built their own pyramids, steeper and more numerous than Egypt's, over 200 of them in the royal cemeteries at Meroe, and developed the Meroitic script, one of the few indigenous writing systems of ancient Africa. The Meroitic alphabet was deciphered over a century ago. We know what sounds the letters represent, but the Meroitic language itself remains poorly understood. We can read the texts aloud, we can sound out the words, but we cannot comprehend what most of them mean, because the language has no well-established relatives and no bilingual key. The history, the literature, the legal codes of one of Africa's greatest civilizations are locked behind a linguistic barrier we have not yet breached. On the Yos Plateau of Nigeria, the Nok culture produced art of haunting beauty and power. Over many centuries, beginning somewhere between 1500 and 900 BCE, depending on which dating method is trusted, Nok sculptors created terracotta figures with triangular eyes, elaborate hairstyles, expressive faces that seem to stare across millennia with knowing intensity. The artistic tradition persisted for over 1,000 years. Even more remarkably, the Nok people were among the earliest ironworkers in the world, smelting iron by 1000 BCE. They appear to have skipped the Bronze Age entirely, leaping directly from stone tools to iron in an independent technological development that confounds the neat progression Western scholarship long assumed was universal. We do not know the Nok people's name for themselves. We do not know their language. We do not know their social structure, their religious beliefs, their political organization. The terracotta figures tell us that they valued art, that they had consistent aesthetic standards across centuries, but the figures cannot speak. They can only look at us with those knowing triangular eyes. The medieval empires of West Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, were among the wealthiest and most powerful states on earth during their respective heydays. When Mansa Musa of Mali made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 CE, travelling with an entourage of thousands and distributing gold so lavishly that he reportedly depressed the value of gold in Cairo for years afterward, he announced the existence of a kingdom of extraordinary wealth to a world that had barely been aware of it. The University of Sankore at Timbuktu was a centre of Islamic learning housing thousands of manuscripts long before the European Renaissance. But our understanding of these empires remains fragmentary. Most of what we know comes from the accounts of Arab scholars and travellers, Ibn Battuta, al-Bakri, al-Umari, who visited from outside and described what they saw through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. The preservation system for African history was, in most regions, primarily oral. Professional historians, griots in West Africa, Imbongi in Southern Africa, Asmari in Ethiopia, memorized and transmitted the histories, genealogies, legal precedents, and cultural narratives of their societies across generations through years of rigorous training. A trained griot could recite dynastic histories spanning centuries, complete with dates, names, relationships, conflicts, and moral lessons, with a fidelity that modern scholars have been able to cross-reference against archaeological evidence. But the oral system had a fatal vulnerability. When communities were disrupted, by slave raids that tore families apart, by colonial wars that killed elders and scattered populations, by famines and epidemics, the chain of transmission could be broken in a single generation. Colonial regimes actively suppressed African historical memory because they understood, at some level, that a people who remember their own achievements are harder to subjugate than a people who have been taught to believe they have no history. The silences are being broken. Recent archaeology, conducted increasingly by African scholars, has revealed complex societies that colonial scholarship had denied or ignored. the ancient city of Geno in modern Mali, has been shown to possess sophisticated urban planning centuries before Islamic contact. The Swahili coast cities, Kilwa, Lamu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, are now understood as unique fusion cultures that blended African, Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian elements into something genuinely original. But the recovery should not obscure the scale of what was lost. What we are reconstructing now is not the full picture. It is fragments, gathered painstakingly from the wreckage of a deliberate cultural catastrophe. I want you to try to imagine something. You're standing on the shore of an island in the central Pacific, sometime around 1000 CE. You're looking out at the ocean, not a river, not a sheltered bay, the open Pacific Ocean, 64 million square miles of water covering more than 1/3 of the entire surface of the Earth. A body of water so vast that you could drop every continent into it and still have ocean left over. Now imagine that somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, there is an island. A small island, maybe a few miles across. A speck in an infinity of water. And you are going to find it. You are going to sail to it in a wooden canoe, a double-hulled outrigger, beautifully crafted from hand-hewn planks lashed together with braided coconut fibre and sealed with breadfruit sap, carrying a woven pandanus leaf sail. You have no compass, no sextant, no chronometer, no charts, no GPS, no radio. Nothing that any European navigator of the 18th century would have recognised as a navigational instrument. You have your eyes, your memory, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of master navigators who trained you from childhood. You carry an entire atlas in your head, encoded not as lines on a map but as relationships between phenomena. A star that rises at this angle means that island is in this direction. A pattern of wave refraction means land is within a certain distance. A species of birds circling overhead means shore is no more than a day's sail away. This is not speculation. This is what Polynesian navigators actually did. By roughly 1200 CE, every inhabitable island in the Pacific Ocean had been found, reached and colonised by Polynesian peoples sailing outrigger canoes. From Tahiti to Hawaii is 2,600 miles of open water, farther than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. From Tahiti to New Zealand, 2,400 miles. Easter Island sits 1,200 miles from the nearest inhabited land, isolated in the southeastern Pacific like a pebble dropped into the centre of an empty room the size of a continent. The settlement of the Pacific is, by any reasonable measure, the single greatest feat of exploration and navigation in all of human history. It dwarfs everything that followed. We know fragments of how they did it. Polynesian navigators memorized the positions of hundreds of stars, using the points where specific stars rise and set as directional markers, essentially creating a star compass that divided the horizon into a series of named bearings. They read wave patterns with a sensitivity that seems almost superhuman to us. They could detect the subtle distortion in open ocean swells caused by the refraction of waves around a distant island, even when that island was far below the horizon. They track the flight paths of specific bird species, knowing that some, like the golden plover, never stray more than a certain distance from land. They observed cloud formations, which often develop over islands due to the heating of the land surface. But by the time Europeans arrived in the Pacific, most of this navigational knowledge was already fading. The last great Polynesian expansion, the settlement of New Zealand by the ancestors of the Maori, around 1300 CE, occurred roughly 200 years before the first European ships entered the Pacific. By the time Europeans began documenting Pacific Island cultures, the era of long-distance open ocean voyaging was largely over. The most detailed surviving accounts of traditional Pacific navigation come not from Polynesia proper, but from Micronesia, specifically the Caroline Islands. But Caroline Island navigation may not be identical to the techniques used by the Polynesians who settled Hawaii, New Zealand, Rapa Nui. The two traditions share common elements, but they may have diverged over centuries. We are studying a surviving cousin of the tradition that accomplished the great voyages, not necessarily the tradition itself. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, illustrates both the achievement and the mystery in its most poignant form. For decades, the standard narrative was that Polynesian settlers arrived around 1200 CE, deforested the island, and collapsed into warfare and cannibalism. Recent research has complicated almost every element of that story. Settlement may have begun as early as 800 CE, The deforestation was not solely the result of human activity. Rats that arrived with the first settlers consumed the nuts of the endemic palm trees, preventing regeneration. The accounts of societal collapse come overwhelmingly from European observers who encountered the island after European-introduced diseases had already devastated the population. The Europeans saw a society in extremis, shattered by the very contact that brought the observers, and they assumed that what they were witnessing was the natural endpoint of the society's own trajectory. And on Rapa Nui sits one of the most tantalising mysteries of all, Rongorongo. The first European to notice it was a Breton lay missionary named Eugène Airault, who arrived on the island in January 1864 and recorded in a letter the existence of wooden tablets covered in tiny carved figures, human shapes, animals, plants, abstract marks, running in neat lines across polished surfaces. Airault mentioned hundreds of tablets in Rapa Nui households. By the time the Bishop of Tahiti, Florentin Etienne Jausen, received his first specimen from converts in 1868, a tablet wound in a cord of human hair, only a few dozen tablets could still be found anywhere on the island. Today, fewer than 30 survive. They are scattered across museums in Rome, London, Washington, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Santiago, a diaspora of driftwood and Pacific rosewood, catalogued and photographed and studied for a century and a half, still silent. What happened between Airault's 1864 account and Jausen's 1868 gift is the heart of the tragedy. In December 1862, Peruvian slave ships began raiding Rapa Nui. By early 1863, between 1,400 and 2,000 islanders had been carried off to work the guano mines on the Chincha Islands, roughly a third to a half of the island's population, and crucially, almost the entire educated class. The paramount chief Kaimakoi was taken, so was his heir. So were the Tangata Rongorongo, the trained scribes and chanters who had been taught from childhood to read and perform the tablets in public ceremonies. International pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors, but most of those who returned were already sick with smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery, and they brought the diseases with them onto an island that had never known them. The population of Rapa Nui, estimated at around 4,000 in the early 1860s, collapsed to approximately 110 people by 1877. An entire literate tradition, preserved not in books but in trained human memory, was annihilated in less than 15 years. Jausen located a Rapa Nui labourer in Tahiti in 1869, a man named Metoro Taua Ure, who claimed to know the tablets by heart. Between 1869 and 1874, Metoro sat with Jausen and chanted from 4 tablets the bishop had collected. The tablets we now call a Tahua, Biaruku Kurenga, Simamari, and Ekati. Jausen transcribed everything. But almost a century later, when the German researcher Thomas Barthel re-examined Jausen's notes, he discovered that Metoro had read one tablet's reverse forward and its obverse backward. The French epigraphist Jacques Gouy later showed that Metoro had also read the lunar calendar on the Mamari tablet backwards, and had failed to recognise the very obvious pictogram of the full moon embedded in its sequence. Whatever Metoro had known about Rongorongo, it was no longer enough to actually read the tablets. He was chanting descriptions. This is a fish. This is a man with raised hands, rather than sounding out text. The next attempt came 12 years later. In December 1886, an American naval officer named William J. Thompson, paymaster aboard the USS Mohican, spent 12 days on Rapa Nui and purchased 2 tablets that are now housed in the Smithsonian. Thompson sought out an elderly man named Uriwai Iko, who had served as steward to Nga'ara, the last Rapa Nui king said to have possessed Rongorongo knowledge. Ura initially refused to read the tablets, explaining that his Christian instructors had forbidden it, and that he feared for his soul. Thompson plied him with alcohol and payment. Eventually Ure chanted a series of texts, from photographs, not the tablets themselves, while a bilingual Tahitian landowner named Alexander Salmon wrote down the words. The result was a collection of chants that read like fragments of Rapa Nui cosmology, creation stories, genealogies of gods. But when scholars later compared Yure's chants against the actual glyph sequences on the tablets, the chants did not match. Yure may have been chanting traditional texts he had memorized from oral instruction as a young man, texts that were associated with the tablets in some general way, but that he could no longer link glyph by glyph to the actual carved signs. These were the last 2 attempts. After 1886, No living person claimed to be able to read Rongorongo, and the knowledge was gone. What remains are the tablets themselves, roughly 24 of them, totalling about 15,000 legible glyphs. The script is written in a pattern called reverse boustrophodon. You begin at the bottom left corner of the tablet, read across to the right, then physically rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the next line, again left to right. Alternate lines appear upside down relative to each other until the reader turns the tablet. This way of writing is almost unique in world history. The glyph inventory contains roughly 120 basic signs, which combine and vary to produce perhaps 600 distinct forms. The carvings depict animals, fish, squid, sea turtles, crayfish, frigate birds, caterpillars, and human figures, plants, celestial bodies, geometric shapes. Most of the tablets appear to have been carved with obsidian flakes or shark teeth, on driftwood or native Toromiro and Pacific rosewood. Some of them are charred, as though half burned and then saved. And one small section of one tablet, the Mammary tablet now housed in Rome, has yielded what may be the only partial reading anyone has achieved. In 1958, Thomas Barthel identified a sequence of crescent-shaped glyphs flanking a full-disk pictogram that appears to correspond to the Rapa Nui lunar calendar, with 30 nights per month and occasional adjustments for leap months. Each crescent seems to represent a specific night phase. The reading has been refined by subsequent researchers, and its alignment with Rapa Nui ethnographic calendars seems genuine. But even the Mammary calendar cannot be translated in a full linguistic sense. We can say quote 0 and quote 1, but we cannot sound out the word for quote 2 or quote 3 in Rapa Nui as the tablet records them. The rest of Rongorongo, the genealogies, the chants, the stories, whatever the carvers meant to preserve, remains inaccessible. What were the tablets? Administrative records, genealogical lists, religious chants, historical chronicles, the world's smallest literature, as one writer has called it, waiting on 24 pieces of wood for a key that may never come. On the Micronesian island of Pohnpei, another monument to Pacific achievement stands in slow-motion ruin. Nan Madol, sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific, is a complex of 92 artificial islands constructed on a coral reef lagoon. The islands were built by stacking enormous columns of naturally formed basalt, hexagonal and pentagonal logs of volcanic rock, some weighing up to 50 tons, into the shallow water of the lagoon. No metal tools were used, no wheels, no pulleys, no draft animals. Human labour alone quarried these massive stones, transported them to the coast, ferried them across the lagoon, and stacked them into walls reaching heights of 25 feet. The complex was built between approximately 1200 and 1500 CE by the Sodelur dynasty. Today, the site is deteriorating, undermined by mangrove growth, battered by storms, threatened by rising sea levels. And then there is the sweet potato, which tells us something astonishing in the quietest possible way. The sweet potato is a South American plant native to Peru and Ecuador, yet when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they found it growing across the Pacific Islands. The Polynesian word for it, kumara, is strikingly similar to words for the same plant in several South American indigenous languages, and recent genetic analysis has confirmed Native American ancestry in some eastern Polynesian populations, dating to approximately 1200 CE. Contact between Polynesia and South America occurred. This is no longer a hypothesis. At some point around 1200 CE, people from opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean met. They exchanged plants, they apparently exchanged genes, and then the contact ended, and for the next 3 centuries, until the European arrival, the two hemispheres went their separate ways again. We know it happened. We cannot say how. They crossed 64 million square miles of ocean, and we barely know their story. Everyone knows the pyramids. They are perhaps the most iconic structures on Earth, reduced to postcard images, decorative motifs on hotel carpets. But behind the familiarity lies a question that, when you really think about it, is genuinely unsettling. Where did Egyptian civilization come from? Around 3100 BCE, Egypt emerges onto the historical stage as a unified kingdom with a fully formed complex society. Hieroglyphic writing is already sophisticated, not the fumbling first attempts of a culture learning to write, but a mature system with established conventions. Administrative systems are functional. Religious concepts are elaborated. Architectural ambitions are already immense. Within 5 centuries of this apparent beginning, the Egyptians are building the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure containing over 2 million stone blocks, aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that modern surveying equipment can barely improve upon, its base level to within less than an inch across more than 13 acres of ground. Before 3100 BCE, what the archaeological record shows in Egypt is scattered Neolithic farming villages, nothing that obviously leads to what comes next. The transition appears to happen with extraordinary rapidity. The comparison with Mesopotamia sharpens the puzzle. In Sumer, we can trace the development of writing from its earliest origins, simple accounting tokens, then pictographic tablets, then increasingly abstract cuneiform signs, across centuries of gradual, traceable development. You can watch the technology evolving step by step, mistake by mistake. In Egypt, nothing comparable exists. Hieroglyphic writing appears in the archaeological record already highly developed. One possible answer lies deep in the desert, at a place called Nabta Playa. 500 kilometers south of Cairo in the Nubian desert, there is a dried lake bed that was once, between roughly 7000 and 3000 BCE, a seasonal oasis. These were not Egyptians who camped there. They were Saharan pastoralists, people of the Green Sahara, a vast grassland that covered what is now the world's largest hot desert during a period of wetter climate known as the African Humid Period. At Nabta Playa, around 5000 BCE, these herders arranged large stones in what appear to be astronomical alignments. One arrangement tracks the summer solstice. These were people with organised communal labour, sustained occupation of specific sites, ritual practices involving megalithic construction, and an interest in tracking celestial events. The Green Sahara migration theory proposes a connection between these Saharan peoples and the emergence of Egyptian civilization. As the Sahara dried out, the most severe desiccation pulse occurring between approximately 5000 and 3000 BCE, perfectly coinciding with the rise of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt. The peoples who had inhabited the Green Sahara for millennia were forced to migrate toward the one reliable water source in the region, the Nile Valley. If this theory is correct, Egyptian civilization didn't spring from nothing. It was the product of a forced convergence, multiple populations with different traditions, different skills, and different bodies of accumulated knowledge crowding into the narrow ribbon of the Nile Valley and creating something new from the combination. The apparent speed of Egyptian civilization's emergence would not be mysterious acceleration but synthesis, the rapid crystallization of a complex society from components that had been developing separately for millennia in a region we can no longer study because it has been buried under centuries of desert sand. The supporting evidence is suggestive, though far from conclusive. Climate data aligns with the timing. Ancient Egyptian DNA shows evidence of multiple population origins. Egyptian mythology contains references to a primordial homeland to the south and west of the Nile Valley. The creation narrative of a primordial mound rising from the waters of chaos has been interpreted by some scholars as a mythologized memory of watching islands appear in seasonal desert lakes as the climate dried and the lakes shrank. But the Sahara is enormous, over 9 million square kilometres, hostile to human life in its current state, and barely explored archaeologically. Any pre-dynastic settlements in the desert would be buried under millennia of sand accumulation. The evidence that might prove or disprove the Green Sahara theory almost certainly exists, but finding it remains one of archaeology's most formidable challenges. Now I want to take you to a place almost no one talks about, not Egypt, not Sumer, somewhere else, somewhere earlier than the pyramids, earlier than the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, earlier even than Sumer's oldest temple towns. A place where, for 2,000 years, people built the largest settlements on Earth, and then periodically, deliberately, burned them all to the ground. In 1884, a Romanian folklorist named Teodor Barada noticed ceramic fragments near the village of Cucuteni in what is now eastern Romania. He collected a few pieces, published a brief note and moved on. 13 years later, in 1897, a Ukrainian archaeologist named Vikenty Cahokia announced the discovery of a large Neolithic site near the village of Tripilia in Kiev Oblast. It would take further decades before anyone realized that these two sites, and thousands of others scattered across Romania, Moldova and Ukraine, belonged to the same civilization. A civilization that we now call, awkwardly, by the names of its two first identified sites, Cucuteni Tripilia. It existed from roughly 5,500 BCE to 2,750 BCE, nearly 3,000 years. At its peak, between 4,100 and 3,600 BCE, it built some of the largest human settlements on Earth, larger than any contemporary settlement in Mesopotamia, larger than any Egyptian town of the period, larger than anything in China or India. At Talyanki, in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists have identified up to 2,700 houses arranged in concentric rings across an area of 450 hectares, over 1,100 acres, with population estimates as high as 21,000 people. At Majdanetsky, archaeomagnetic surveys have mapped about 2,300 burned clay buildings. At Nebelivka, a site of 238 hectares, research teams have used magnetic radiometry to produce the first complete architectural plan of a mega-settlement in Europe. More than 29 Cucuteni Tripilia sites had areas greater than 100 hectares. The settlements were organised around concentric circles of houses facing inward towards shared central spaces, a layout that suggests an architectural ethos profoundly different from the radial, hierarchical urban forms of the Near East. And here is the extraordinary thing. There are no palaces, no monumental stone architecture, no rigid social stratification visible in the houses, which are remarkably uniform in size and furnishings, no centralised kingship, no evidence of warfare between settlements, no weapons caches, no fortifications oriented against external enemies. The Cucuteni Tripilia people built cities the size of early Uruk, and they built them apparently without kings. They were skilled farmers. They cultivated wheat, barley, peas, flax. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. Their pottery, decorated with swirling red, black and white motifs, is among the most sophisticated ceramic traditions of prehistoric Europe. Modern master potters, attempting to reproduce it with traditional methods, have struggled to match its quality. They crafted thousands of small clay figurines, usually female, sometimes abstracted, often seated, their bodies incised with geometric designs that may echo the patterns of tattoos or textiles long since decayed. In the mid-20th century, the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Maria Gimbutas looked at these figurines and saw evidence of what she called old European civilization, a peaceful, matrilineal, goddess-worshipping culture that she believed flourished across southeastern Europe before being displaced by Indo-European horse-riding patriarchies sweeping in from the steppes. Gimbutas's interpretation captivated a generation of readers. It has also been heavily contested by subsequent archaeologists, who point out that figurine traditions are notoriously difficult to interpret, that religious meaning cannot be read directly from iconography, and that the absence of visible male figures in the clay record does not necessarily indicate a female-dominated society. What is not contested is that the figurines mattered to the Cucuteni Tripilia people, and that they made them by the tens of thousands, and that many were broken or buried deliberately inside the houses that were themselves burned and buried. What is also not contested is that we do not know the names of any of the figures. They had names, every one of them. Every seated woman with incised thighs and schematized eyes was a specific presence to the person who shaped her. She had a story. She does not have one anymore. They may have practiced some of the earliest forms of metallurgy in Europe, working copper into ornaments. They may have possessed the earliest known wheeled toys, small clay objects with perforated holes that suggest axles, and every 60 to 80 years they burned their own cities to the ground. This is not a metaphor. Archaeological excavations at site after site, at Talyanki, at Majdanetsky, at Nebelivka, at smaller settlements scattered across the culture's vast territory, reveal clear evidence that the houses were deliberately set on fire. The burning was thorough. The fires were hot enough to vitrify the clay walls, turning mud-daubed structures into ceramic. Experimental archaeology conducted by the AHRC funded Early Urbanism in Europe project at Nebelivka confirmed what excavators long suspected. To burn a tripillion house to the temperatures observed in the archaeological record, the inhabitants would have had to stack additional fuel inside the house before lighting it. These were not accidents, these were ceremonies, and then on the ashes of the old settlement, sometimes directly on top of it, sometimes nearby, they rebuilt. The same concentric layout, the same inward-facing houses, the same patterns of community space, and they lived there for another 60 or 80 years, and then they burned it again. Why? No one knows with certainty. The honest scholars will tell you that. Theories have multiplied across the century and more since the sites were first excavated. Some researchers have proposed that the burnings were purely practical, that after several decades, houses accumulated infestations, rot or structural weaknesses severe enough that demolition was easier than repair. Others suggest a ritual dimension, that the Tripillian people believed houses were living entities with finite lifespans, and that burning them was a form of funerary rite, a dignified death for the structure that had sheltered a family or a community. Some archaeologists have argued that the burnings were linked to the deaths of significant individuals, or to the exhaustion of nearby agricultural soil, or to periodic reorganizations of social space. The Ukrainian archaeologists Natalia Burdo and Mikhailo Videyko have documented multiple phases of interim rituals, smaller burnings of individual houses that were then buried in pits, alongside the massive settlement-wide conflagrations that marked periodic abandonment. We will probably never know which of these explanations is correct, or whether the answer is some combination of all of them. What we do know is that this pattern of construction, burning and rebuilding, persisted for more than 1,000 years across an enormous territory. It was not a local quirk, it was a cultural practice, carried forward by hundreds of generations. Around 2750 BCE, the mega-settlements dissolved. The people seem to have scattered into smaller communities, and over the following centuries, the Cucuteni Tripelia culture faded from the archaeological record. The reasons remain debated. Climate change, soil exhaustion, the arrival of Indo-European-speaking peoples from the east, internal social transformations. Whatever the cause, the mega-settlement phase of European prehistory ended, and no comparable concentrations of population would emerge in the region for another 3,000 years. The Cucuteni Tripelia people built for the present, and the present was enough. Every 60 or 80 years they chose to consume what they had built and begin again. It is a relationship with permanence and impermanence that has no parallel in the history we have inherited. A civilization that assumed nothing was meant to last, and built anyway, and built beautifully, and burned it down when its time was done. We have been moving backward in time all night. Now we go all the way back, to the edge of what we can know, to the catastrophe that may have reset human civilization at the exact moment it was poised for its greatest transformation. 12,900 years ago, the world was on the verge of something extraordinary. The last ice age was ending. For 7,000 years, glaciers had been retreating, temperatures rising, sea levels climbing. Vast new territories of habitable land were opening up across the northern hemisphere. The climate was warming toward conditions that, for the first time in 100,000 years, would be hospitable to settled human communities across large parts of the earth. And human beings were ready. In the Levant, the Natufian culture had established permanent stone settlements. Not seasonal camps, not temporary shelters. Permanent villages with stone foundations, hearths, storage pits, grinding stones, and specialized sickle blades designed for harvesting wild grain. They were on the very threshold of agriculture. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture was producing art of astonishing quality. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet depict animals with naturalistic detail, anatomical precision, dynamic movement that would not be matched in European art for another 10,000 years. In North America, the Clovis culture had developed a distinctive and remarkably effective toolkit, exquisitely crafted fluted spear points, made by a specific knapping technique that required considerable skill. Clovis points have been found across the entire North American continent, from coast to coast. Something was about to happen. The pieces were in place for the fundamental transformation of human civilization, and then, in a span measured in decades, the world lurched backward into 1,000 years of cold. Around 12,900 years ago, global temperatures plummeted. The warming trend reversed. Conditions returned to something approaching full glacial severity. For 1,300 years, a period scientists call the Younger Dryas, named after a cold-loving wildflower that spread across Europe, the world was locked in a climatic reversal. The effects on human populations were catastrophic. In North America, 35 genera of large mammals went extinct during or immediately following the onset of the Younger Dryas. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears. These were not obscure marginal species. They had survived multiple previous glacial cycles. They could not survive this one. The Clovis culture, which had depended on these large animals as prey, disappears from the archaeological record essentially simultaneously. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains one of the most contested questions in earth science. The mainstream explanation involves the disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt of ocean currents that distributes heat from the tropics to the higher latitudes. As the North American ice sheet melted, it released enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic, possibly through the catastrophic drainage of glacial lake gases, a body of fresh water larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. This influx of fresh water diluted the salinity of the North Atlantic, disrupting the circulation system. Without that circulation, heat transfer from equator to pole was interrupted, and the northern hemisphere cooled. But there is a rival hypothesis, controversial, fiercely debated, unresolved. In 2007, a team of researchers proposed that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid, or possibly multiple fragments of a disintegrating comet, exploding over the North American ice sheet. The evidence they cited included a thin sediment layer from exactly this period containing nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, platinum concentrations far above background levels, high-temperature melt glass, and what they identified as shock-fractured quartz. The hypothesis ignited a scientific firestorm. A comprehensive review published in 2023 by a team led by Vance Holliday concluded that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has not converged into a credible, self-consistent explanation and should be considered refuted. A 2025 analysis of the platinum anomaly in a Greenland ice core, long cited as a key piece of evidence, found that the platinum spike appeared 45 years after a cluster of volcanic eruptions in Iceland and lasted 14 years, a pattern some researchers argue is inconsistent with an instantaneous impact. And yet the hypothesis has not entirely disappeared. Researchers continue to report finding platinum, microspherules, and melt glass in sediments from eastern North America and marine cores from Baffin Bay. A vocal minority of scientists continues to defend the hypothesis. The mainstream consensus leans strongly against it, but the debate persists. Whatever caused the Younger Dryas, its consequences for human civilization were profound and lasting. 1,300 years of renewed cold interrupted the trajectory that human societies across the Northern Hemisphere had been following for millennia. And then, right at the very end of the Younger Dryas, as the climate was finally warming again around 9,500 BCE, something appeared that should not have been possible. Göbekli Tepe. In southeastern Turkey, on a rocky hilltop with panoramic views across the Harran Plain, hunter-gatherers built a complex of massive stone enclosures featuring T-shaped limestone pillars up to 20 feet tall and weighing between 7 and 10 tons. The pillars are carved with intricate, detailed images of animals: snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, cranes, spiders, and some pillars bear anthropomorphic features, with arms and hands carved in relief, suggesting that they may represent stylized human figures, perhaps ancestors or deities. The site predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, and the Great Pyramid by more than 7,000 years. This was built by people who had not yet invented agriculture, had not yet domesticated animals, had not yet made pottery, or so we thought. Recent excavations have complicated this picture. Archaeologists have found grinding stones, flint sickles, plant residues, and what appear to be domestic living structures at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting that its builders may have been on the very cusp of the agricultural transition. The discovery of a water supply system, carved channels feeding cisterns in the bedrock capable of holding at least 150 cubic meters of rainwater, suggests that the site was occupied for sustained periods. In September 2025, Turkey's Minister of Culture announced the discovery of a life-size human statue at Göbekli Tepe, the first of its kind found at the site. It had been embedded horizontally in the base of a wall between structures B and D, apparently as a votive offering. As of recent estimates, no more than about 5 to 10% of the site has been excavated. Geophysical surveys indicate the presence of at least 15 additional enclosures still buried underground. Archaeologists estimate that it may take 150 years to fully explore the site. Here is the question that haunts every archaeologist who studies this period. If the people who built Göbekli Tepe at the end of the Younger Dryas were capable of this, what might their predecessors have been capable of before the catastrophe began? The skills required to build Göbekli Tepe do not appear overnight. They are the products of generations, possibly centuries, of accumulated practice. Where is the evidence of the tradition that preceded it? Some of that evidence may be buried under 1,300 years of climatic catastrophe. Some of it may be submerged beneath rising seas. At the peak of the Ice Age, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than today, exposing millions of square miles of coastal land that is now underwater. Coastlines are exactly where we would expect ancient peoples to have lived, rich in marine resources, mild in climate, connected by water routes for trade and communication, which brings us to the place beneath the waves. In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Kalinda was working the North Sea, about 25 miles east of the English coast, near a shallow bank known as Leman and Ower. As the crew hauled in their nets, they pulled up a lump of peat. That was unusual in itself. Peat forms on land in freshwater bogs, not on the seafloor. But stranger still was what was inside the peat. A barbed antler spear point, beautifully crafted, clearly worked by human hands. The crew brought the artefact ashore. It was sent to the British Museum. Experts examined it and concluded that it was a Mesolithic harpoon point, dating to somewhere between 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, the era of European hunter-gatherers just before the invention of agriculture. The year after its discovery, pollen analysis of the peat confirmed something that should have been impossible. The peat had formed in a freshwater environment, on dry land before that land was covered by the North Sea. There had been a country out there, under the water, and people had lived on it. Today we call that country Doggerland, named for Dogger Bank, a submerged sandbank frequented by Dutch fishing boats called doggers. The name was coined in the late 1990s by the archaeologist Brian E. Coles of the University of Exeter. Doggerland was real. It was enormous. At its greatest extent, it connected Britain to mainland Europe, stretching from Scotland and northern England across to the Netherlands, Denmark, and northern Germany. Somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 square kilometres of habitable land, an area roughly equivalent to modern Britain, sat exposed during the last ice age, and gradually submerged as the glaciers melted and the seas rose. It was not a wasteland. Recent sedimentary DNA analysis by researchers at the University of Warwick, published in 2026, has shown that temperate woodland species, oak, elm, hazel, were already growing in southern Doggerland more than 16,000 years ago, several thousand years earlier than they appear in mainland Britain. The landscape was a mosaic of marshes, wooded valleys, gentle hills, and slow-moving rivers. It teemed with wildlife, mammoth tusks, rhinoceros bones, and the remains of aurochs, red deer, and wild horses have been dredged from the North Sea floor by fishing trawlers for more than a century. For the Mesolithic peoples of Europe, Doggerland was not a land bridge. It was a heartland, one of the richest hunter-gatherer landscapes on Earth. So imagine them for a moment, the people who lived there. Archaeologists have given one of their main cultures a name, the Maglemosians, active roughly from 9,000 to 6,000 BCE, named for a Danish bog site whose peat preserved their tools. They made microliths, small sharp flakes of flint set into wooden hafts to create composite spears, arrows, and harpoons. They worked bone and antler with great skill, producing the barbed points that still surface in trawler nets. They built dugout canoes from hollowed-out logs. Some of the oldest boats in European archaeology come from Doggerland's margins. They wove fish traps from willow. They followed herds of red deer and aurochs across the plains. They collected hazelnuts in enormous quantities and stored them in pits. They ate eel, pike, perch. They lived in temporary camps along the banks of rivers that no longer exist, and in more permanent hamlets at the confluences of those rivers, and in shelters in the reed beds where birds gathered in uncountable flocks during the spring and autumn migrations. We know these things not by direct excavation. Doggerland is still mostly underwater, but by analogy with the Mesolithic sites we have on land at places like Starcar in Yorkshire, where the waterlogged peat has preserved wooden platforms, antler headdresses worn by shamans or hunters, and the bones of deer killed and processed 9,000 years ago. The Doggerlanders were the neighbours and kin of the Starcar people. They shared the same tool traditions, the same styles of bone carving, the same seasonal rhythms. When Starcar was active, Doggerland was still above water. You could have walked from Yorkshire to the heart of Doggerland in a week of steady walking, and then to Denmark in another 2. And the North Sea has been patient about surrendering its secrets. Bone harpoon points, dugout canoes, wooden paddles, fish traps woven from split willow rods, preserved almost perfectly by the oxygen-poor mud, sets of human footprints preserved in compressed clay with as many as 39 consecutive prints in a single track, revealing the gait and pace of someone who walked across wet mud thousands of years ago and left a signature that only the sea could read. A fragment of human skull, dated to approximately 13,000 years before present. A Neanderthal skull fragment pushing the region's human occupation back 40,000 years, meaning Doggerland, or what Doggerland would become, was inhabited even when the first modern humans were still spreading out of Africa. Some of the richest concentrations of artefacts come from the Rhine-Meuse Delta, off the coast of the Netherlands, where Dutch fishermen and amateur collectors have recovered thousands of bone and antler points, stone tools, pieces of worked wood, and even human burials from the shallow sediments. Dutch researchers have a name for the submerged riverbanks where these finds concentrate: the steekles, the spines. They are the edges of drowned landforms, the places where Mesolithic people camped because the rivers provided water and the banks provided vantage points over the herds. In 2019, a team from the University of Bradford and Ghent University, sampling the seabed about 25 miles off the coast of Cromer in Norfolk, recovered a hammerstone flint from a depth of 32 metres, a simple tool used to strike flakes from other stones, dating to a time when the hammerstone's owner was standing on dry land. A small, ordinary object, dropped or discarded by a real person, who then walked away across a landscape that no longer exists. Since 2015, the University of Bradford's Submerged Landscapes Research Centre, led by Professor Vince Gaffney, has mapped approximately 188,000 square kilometres of the North Sea floor, an area about the size of England and Scotland combined. Using seismic data provided largely by energy companies drilling for oil and gas, the team has reconstructed ancient river channels, coastlines, estuaries, and hillsides that have been underwater for thousands of years. They have traced the path of a drowned river they call the Outer Silver Pit, a waterway that once flowed across the central plain of Doggerland for hundreds of kilometres before spilling into what is now the English Channel. They have identified salt marshes, brackish estuaries, freshwater lakes. They have produced interactive maps that show Doggerland's gradual transformation from a vast continental plain 20,000 years ago to a shrinking archipelago 8,000 years ago to a single island to nothing. The drowning was slow at first. For 3,000 years, sea levels rose at an average rate of roughly 6 feet per century. In some places and some centuries, the rate was even faster. As much as 1 to 2 metres of sea level rise in 100 years, enough that a coastal village built by a grandfather could be underwater by the time his grandchildren were grown. Coastal villages would have been abandoned in the lifetimes of the people who built them. Fishing grounds would have changed. Hunting routes would have flooded. Generation after generation of Doggerlanders watched their homeland shrink. The oral traditions passed down around the fires on long winter nights must have included countless stories of places that used to exist, of grandmothers' camps now under the tide, of the names of rivers that no longer ran. And then, around 6,200 BCE, the drowning became sudden. Off the coast of Norway, at the edge of the continental shelf, an enormous slab of seafloor sediment, an area of roughly 3,000 cubic kilometres, a volume equivalent to the entirety of the state of Iceland, suddenly collapsed and slid into the deep ocean. This was the Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater landslides known from the entire Holocene. It triggered a tsunami. The waves that spread across the North Atlantic from the Storegga Slide have been reconstructed by modern researchers. Deposits from the tsunami have been identified on the eastern coast of Scotland, where waves reached heights of at least 20 metres. Similar deposits have been found in the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and along the Norwegian coast. The tsunami penetrated up to 40 kilometres inland in some areas. Any Doggerlanders living on the low-lying plains of their homeland on that day had no warning, no high ground, no survival of their homes, their boats, their supplies. And yet, and this is one of the strangest revelations of recent research, Doggerland did not disappear entirely that day. A 2020 study by British and Estonian scientists found evidence that some uplands, particularly the Doggerbank itself, survived the tsunami as small islands. Perhaps a quarter of Doggerland's Mesolithic population was killed by the Strega event, but a remnant endured. The last islands of Doggerland lingered for another 1,000 years, shrinking slowly as sea levels continued to rise. By 5000 BCE, Doggerbank itself was gone. The lost land had become open ocean. What did the Doggerlanders know? What did they carry with them, in boats and in memory, when they fled to the shores of Britain or Jutland or the Netherlands? Did the flood stories of northwest European prehistory, the oldest oral traditions of the Germanic and Celtic peoples, the echoes of submerged kingdoms in later Welsh and Breton legend, trace back distantly to the drowning of Doggerland? We cannot say with certainty. Oral traditions are not time capsules, and the people who fled Doggerland were illiterate, and any stories they told across campfires in the centuries that followed have been reshaped 100 times since. But something almost certainly survived. A memory of the sea rising, a memory of the country that used to be. And Doggerland is not alone. Around the entire perimeter of every continent, the coastlines of the Ice Age world lie submerged. Sunderland, off the coast of Southeast Asia, an area larger than India that sat exposed during the Ice Age, now drowned beneath the shallow seas between Java, Sumatra and Borneo. Brynja, the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, most of which is now beneath the Bering Sea. The vast continental shelves of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf. All of them were habitable, all of them likely inhabited, and nearly all of them remain almost entirely unexplored by archaeologists. At the University of Bradford, researchers are now using artificial intelligence to scan the seismic data they have gathered, looking for signatures of human settlement, hearths, midden heaps, post-hole patterns, buried beneath the silt of the North Sea floor. If they succeed, they may find what no land-based archaeologist has ever seen. The villages of people who lived at the very dawn of the modern human age, preserved in oxygen-free mud, untouched by farming or industry or the great disruptions of later history. An entire chapter of the human story written on the bottom of the sea. We have travelled a long way tonight, and I want to be honest with you about what we have and have not done. I have not solved anything. None of these mysteries have tidy answers, and anyone who tells you they know exactly what happened to the Bronze Age, or the Indus Valley, or Cahokia, or Doggerland, is either oversimplifying or has an agenda that has nothing to do with honest inquiry. The gaps are real, the silences are real, but I want to leave you with two thoughts tonight before you drift off entirely. The first is this: every civilization we have visited believed itself to be permanent. The Bronze Age kings of the Mediterranean, the senators of Rome, the navigators of Polynesia, the builders of Cahokia, the quiet potters of Caral, the cotton traders of the Indus, the Cucuteni Tripelia people with their 1,000-year-long rhythm of construction and fire, the Doggerlanders walking along the shores of a country that was slowly drowning beneath their feet. None of them imagined that their grandchildren would forget how to read their writing, or that their cities would crumble into unrecognizable mounds, or that future peoples would stand among their ruins and wonder who they were. We are not exempt from the forces that unmade them. Our own civilization, with all its technologies, is subject to the same dynamics of complexity, interconnection, and specialization that brought down the Bronze Age world. The hard drives that store our digital memories are more fragile than clay tablets. They corrupt, they degrade, they become unreadable as the hardware and software needed to access them become obsolete. The specialized knowledge that runs our society is distributed across millions of specialists, each of whom holds a small piece of a vast puzzle. The moment the coordination fails, much of that knowledge becomes inaccessible. This is not a prediction of doom. It is an observation about civilization itself. Civilization is not a state. It is a process, a continuous, active, effortful process of maintaining knowledge, training new practitioners, investing in infrastructure, and adapting to changing conditions. The moment that process is interrupted, the knowledge begins to slip away, quietly, irreversibly, like water draining from a bath. The second thought is this: the gaps are not just warnings, they are also invitations. The tools we have for recovering lost paths are better than they have ever been. LiDAR is revealing entire cities hidden beneath jungle canopy. Ancient DNA analysis is tracing population movements, invisible to traditional archaeology. Satellite imagery is identifying archaeological features across vast areas of desert, forest, and ocean floor. Multispectral imaging is reading texts beneath palimpsests, recovering words that monks scraped away 1,000 years ago. Machine learning algorithms are being applied to undeciphered scripts, the Indus signs, linear A, rongo, searching for patterns that human analysts might miss. Sedimentary DNA can now reconstruct the plant and animal life of a drowned landscape from mud samples drilled out of the North Sea floor. We are living in what future historians may recognise as a golden age of archaeological discovery. The Amazon is yielding urban landscapes that nobody imagined existed. Göbekli Tepe is rewriting the story of civilization's origins with every season of excavation. The Sahara is slowly revealing the traces of peoples who inhabited it when it was green. Underwater archaeology is beginning to explore the drowned coastlines where Ice Age peoples once lived. Every year, new technologies push the boundaries of what is recoverable further than they have ever been pushed. And yet, the civilizations we have discussed tonight were not abstractions. They were not statistics, not data points. They were people, mothers who held their newborns in the flickering lamplight and whispered promises about the future. Fathers who taught their children to work with their hands and told them stories about where they came from. Builders who stepped back from their work and felt the quiet satisfaction of a wall well made. Priests who believed, with all their hearts, in the power of the rituals they performed. Poets who lay awake at night reaching for words that could capture the way starlight looks on water, or the sound of a child laughing, or the ache of missing someone who is gone. Every one of those people experienced the world as vividly, as completely, as urgently as you experience yours right now. They had opinions, preferences, grudges, dreams, inside jokes, regrets, and secret ambitions. They were in every way that matters, fully human, as rich in consciousness, as complex in feeling, as deserving of remembrance as any person alive today. And for the overwhelming majority of them, no trace of their individual lives survives. Not a name, not a face, not a single recorded word. That is the true weight of these lost epochs. Not the frustration of unsolved puzzles, but the annihilation of lived experience on a scale that dwarfs any individual tragedy. The silence is not empty, it is full of lives that were lived completely and are now completely gone. And yet the fact that we care, the fact that we devote our finest technologies and sharpest minds to recovering even the smallest fragments of these lost worlds, says something about what kind of species we are. We are a species that refuses to accept silence as the final word. We dig through rubble, we decode scripts, we scan jungles from the sky and ocean floors from submarines. We build machines that can read the traces of ink scraped off parchment 1,000 years ago. We do all of this because we feel, at some deep and ineradicable level, that every human story matters. So as you drift off tonight, let this be what you carry. Not fear, not grief. Simply the knowledge that underneath the map of the known world there is another map. A map of drowned countries and unread scripts and cities whose names their own builders have forgotten. A map that is still being drawn, tonight, in laboratories and archives and excavation trenches all over the world. Somewhere beneath the jungle canopy, a LiDAR scanner is passing overhead. Somewhere in a museum storeroom, a palimpsest is being photographed in ultraviolet light. Somewhere on the seafloor, sediment cores are being taken from the drowned valleys of Doggerland. Somewhere, right now, a young archaeologist is kneeling in the dirt with a soft brush, uncovering the edge of something that has not been seen in 3,000 years. The past is waiting. It is patient. It will still be there tomorrow. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a quiet like to help others find their way here. If you'd like to continue wandering through the silences, there's a playlist of companion stories waiting. And if a particular image or civilization is still echoing in your mind as you drift off, leave it in the comments. I read them, and I often follow the threads listeners leave behind into the next night's story. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.